Okay, can we start, please? Can I begin by welcoming you all to our Innovation and Engagement public lecture series. Thank you all for coming. We're delighted this evening to welcome Professor Peter Jackson, who has been one of the pioneering researchers for many years in the United Kingdom in terms of thinking about consumption, in terms of thinking about commodity cultures, and above all about thinking about food in a cultural, political sense. And this evening, Peter will be talking partly about his project, which was funded by the European Research Council on food anxieties. And he'll be adding to that story more recent work that he's been doing on the controversies around the Horsemeat scandal. So will you join me, please, in thanking and welcoming Peter Jackson.
Thank you, Kevin, for that very nice introduction. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm thrilled by the audience. Thank you very much for coming. As Kevin said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a project which I've just completed, funded by the European Research Council, about consumer anxieties about food. And then I want to segue into an example that tries to apply the kind of ideas and framework that we developed in the European Research Council project to the recent, indeed ongoing, incident around horsemeat. So let me just start though with some sort of establishing the context or the extent to which we might think of European and UK consumers as anxious about food. So this is some data from Eurobarometer, which is a big social survey of the EU member states, from November 2010, with around 1,000 respondents from each of the EU states. So it's a big survey of 26,000 people. And it shows what I think of as remarkably high levels of anxiety about food across the EU, and relevant to my argument, quite variable levels of anxiety about different issues in different places. So one of the things I'm going to try and argue is that anxiety isn't just a matter of personal insecurity or an individual pathology. We can think of anxiety in a more kind of sociological or historical or geographical kind of way, of something which kind of peaks and troughs, which varies across place. So it might be about individuals being anxious, but it's also, as I'll try and illustrate, something about the kind of social dimensions of anxiety. So here from 2010, Eurobarometer's big survey showed that almost half, 48% of EU citizens were concerned that food might damage their health, and this had increased a little bit since 2005, when the last survey was conducted. And although it's lower in Europe, just under a third, in the UK, just under a third, it's still a substantial number of people who report concerns that food may damage their health. Levels of concern about the quality and freshness of food are higher. So two-thirds, just over two-thirds, 68% of EU citizens expressed themselves very or fairly worried about the quality of freshness in food, and that was almost exactly the same level in the UK as across Europe more generally, 66%. And over half of respondents, you have to kind of get your head around this, it's sort of expressed the wrong way round, but over half of respondents disagreed that food today is safer than 10 years ago. So put the other way around, about half of EU citizens were worried that food was less safe than it was 10 years ago. Again, that was lower in the UK, but still around a third of citizens. I think this is useful background. I'm not going to talk much more about social survey research in this talk, but it at least establishes a sort of baseline of European-wide concern about food. You know, of course we might say food may damage our health, so there's questions about how the survey is worded. There are questions about the reliability of reported attitudes and so on, but it's just there as a sort of setting the scene. High levels of anxiety about food across Europe, and we might think about are they above or below a level you might expect them to be? Do we think that food is safer and better regulated now than it has been in the past? Why are these levels of reported anxiety so high? And that's what we set about trying to answer in this project. Not through, as I say, survey kind of work, but by a whole range of other means. So the project I've just finished, I have to give a word to my sponsor here, European Research Council, was called Consumer Culture in an age of anxiety. An age of anxiety is in scare quotes for reasons I'll come to in a moment. It had the dreadful acronym CONANX, which no one could ever pronounce, but it means consumer anxiety, and explored consumer anxieties about food, a range of anxieties at a range of geographical scales. So it includes kind of global concerns about rises in commodity prices or population outstripping our ability to feed people and so on, right down to the level of individuals and households and notions of food hygiene, notions of domestic practice within your and my household. So it was a big project across a whole range of scales. And if you ever apply for European money, you need a diagram. That's my top tip for today, I think. A diagram which shows that a range of unrelated projects or work packages in European speak have a tremendous coherence and integrity. So this is my diagram that tried to do that. It has the conceit of going across the whole agri-food chain from production through to consumption and indeed beyond into cycles of use and reuse and food waste and so on. And it also, on the other axis, talks about the way in which we need to think not just about a political economy of food, in terms of food markets and governance and regulation and so on, but also the way that political economy is simultaneously a moral economy in terms of the values we attach to food. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So I don't want to go through this in detail. You can have a look at the CONANX website if you want to, but it ranges from projects about the infant formula issues in China in 2008, through exports from Thailand and Brazil of chickens and prawns, through to questions about food scares in the UK and Sweden, through to domestic household level activity, and the final one was about product reformulation, trying to how businesses are trying to reduce salt, fat and sugar in foods whilst maintaining all the aesthetic properties we enjoy. So it was a big project, 4 or 5 years. And one of the things it addressed was a whole range of anxieties. So one of the questions we might get to in the lively Q&A, which Kevin has promised me, is, are these things all the same? Can we lump them together as food anxieties? Or are they kind of incommensurable in some way? So as I've said, one of our issues will be about food security as an anxiety. It's a different kind of anxiety from, should you wash the chicken before you put it in the oven? But food security will current issue of huge political attention, given a kind of drive that this was no longer a question just for the global south, but it was a question for the global north as well, through the price spike of agricultural commodities in 2007-8, gave rise to headlines about tortilla riots in Mexico and tomato boycotts in Italy and so on. Food security was one issue, food safety would be another, and the one we focused on specifically was the infant formula issue in China in 2008, which led to kidney problems for loads of kids and several deaths, and was the result of deliberate contamination of infant formula. A series of questions about food quality. So why is it that UK consumers are concerned about the provenance of their chicken for their Sunday lunch, but seem less concerned about the chicken, or indeed the prawns, in their chicken tikka masala ready meal, which much more likely comes from Thailand or Brazil than from the UK or Europe? So why is it that different animal species and different levels of processing generate different kinds of anxieties? We're interested in food contamination, and I've already given the example of how the Food Standards Agency has sort of changed its advice on whether or not to wash poultry before you cook it. It used to be advised you to do that. It then decided that the cross-contamination from water splashing around the kitchen would cause more harm than good, and as long as you cook your poultry at the right temperature, you'll be okay. So that's one of the things that might give rise to anxiety, that expert opinion, scientific advice, government advice changes from time to time. A whole series of questions about the relationship between food labelling and waste, particularly around unhelpful labels like best before, which people interpret as being a food safety thing when it's actually a food quality thing. So the confusion between best before, used by, display until, and so on gives rise to a whole series of uncertainties that might lead to anxiety. And lastly, I mentioned this project we also did on product reformulation. where manufacturers and processors are trying to innovate in ways that are good for environmental sustainability or good for public health without reducing the mouthfeel and other aesthetic and sensory issues around food that we all enjoy. And I haven't said that yet as well. In focusing on food anxieties, that's my thing. And I have to constantly remind myself that food is also a source of great pleasure. Commensality, eating together, has been one of the bonds that keeps society together. So I'll end up on that point if I don't mention it all the way through, that we're talking here about a balance between pleasure and anxiety. My particular focus on this project is about anxiety, but I'm not kind of doomsayer. So I've established then a bit about the kind of social parameters of anxiety across Europe. I've talked a bit about our specific project. We're not the only ones to have thought about food anxiety, but there is surprisingly little academic research on anxiety compared to other related topics like risk, for example. And these are just 3 recent-ish examples of other academics who've written about anxiety, and I'm going to suggest that they do it kind of in parentheses. It's in the subtitle of the book. It's in the title of the book, but it's not in the index. People talk about anxiety as a sort of general context without properly defining it and without going into a lot of detail about it. So this globe as hamburger kind of representation is from Griffith and Wallace's book, Consuming Passions, Food in the Age of Anxiety. The book says almost nothing about what the age of anxiety might be. Suzanne Freeberg's excellent book, French Beans and Food Scares, subtitle, Culture and Commerce in an Anxious Age. You try and find anxiety in the index, not there. And John Coveney's book, Food, Morals and Meaning, The Pleasures and Anxiety of Eating, has this nice focus on the kind of dialectic between pleasure and anxiety. But again, there's not a kind of thorough account of anxiety within the book, and that's what we set out to do. This is a chance for me to plug my recent book called Food Words, which includes essays on just over 60 of our contemporary food words, and anxiety, you won't be surprised to know, is one of them. It kind of took its lead from Raymond Williams' book Keywords, which those of you who know the book know is not like a dictionary. It's not trying to find a once and for all definition of our keywords. It's tracing the meanings of words as they change over time, as they come in and out of fashion, as they circulate in commerce and government and newspapers, as well as in academic work. So when we set about defining anxiety, we start from the position that there's not a huge amount of literature on anxiety from a sociological perspective. There's quite a bit, of course, in the psychoanalytic tradition. But compared to words like trust or risk or now security or resilience and lots of other words of the moment, there's much less discussion in the literature, we argue, on anxiety. The key message, I think, of today's talk is to try and think about anxiety then, not just as a personal, individualized condition, like, I'm afraid of the dark kind of thing, but thinking about anxiety as well as that, thinking of its social dimensions. So thinking about anxiety as a social condition. Why are we in Europe today so anxious about food and in so many different ways? And part of the argument about its kind of social nature is that it varies historically, geographically and sociologically. Not just about individuals and their particular concerns. There are patterns to consumer anxieties about food that I'm going to explore. And then I thought I ought to give a proper dictionary style definition of anxiety. And it's a really interesting word. It literally means a constriction in the throat. So as I stand up here to talk, I make sure I have a glass of water, because as you start to give public talks, your mouth dries and you have a series of other physiological reactions. So it's definitely an embodied physical, medical, quasi-medical kind of state. But it's also a state of agitation. It's about being troubled in mind. It's nearly always an uneasiness about a coming event. Literally from things like I'm anxious not to miss my train tomorrow is different from kind of deep angst and existential anxiety. So anxiety covers a whole range of different things, and I think we shouldn't forget it has at least 3 dimensions or registers. It's affective, it's about emotion, it's about embodiment. So when I'm anxious, my mouth dries up, I might start to perspire, sorry about that. And it's also behavioural. I might flee or I might fight, fight and flight. So anxiety is a really interesting word, and it's, I think, very surprising that the kind of founding fathers, usually fathers, of social theory have written so little about anxiety. Even people like Georg Simmel in The Metropolis of Mental Life don't really focus on anxiety, the word itself. So, in my title, I had that idea about, do we live in an age of anxiety? And what would that mean? I put it in scare quotes because a lot of people talk about living in an age of anxiety. But again, we need to be careful about that. If you do a Google search for age of anxiety, you find books on the McCarthy period in America. You find books on Renaissance Europe and religious belief. You find things about contemporary food as well. So it's establishing whether the current period is more anxious than another period in time is very tricky. And of course that's partly about the kind of word games. Is a fear of a lack of food the same as an anxiety about a food allergy? So actually, if you were trying to do that, are we more anxious now than we were in the past? It would be a tricky historical job to do. All that said, there is no shortage of people suggesting that our age is uniquely anxious. And that one of the earliest recent books on anxiety, The Meaning of Anxiety by Rollo May, says quite confidently here in 1950, the evidence is overwhelming that men and women of today live in an age of anxiety, a state of nameless and formless uneasiness. That rolls forward to more recent studies, in this case by a medical sociologist called Ian Wilkinson. It's now a matter of sociological common sense to identify ourselves as living through a period of acute insecurity and high anxiety. And the academics in the room will realise that something called sociological common sense that's what we have to challenge. That's what our job is, in a way, is to problematise these kind of terms. I could give you lots of others, of journalists and other critics talking about how we're anxious and why we're anxious today. And in relation to food, here is everyone's favourite newspaper, the Daily Mail, sort of screaming in exasperation. So what is safe to eat? A bombshell report yesterday, cancer experts add bacon, ham and drink to the danger list. So again, I could give you dozens of other headlines of a similar kind. There is a discourse, a discussion, a moment around food and anxiety, which could be argued to kind of run ahead of the evidence, if you like. My favourite of all of these people who write about the current age of anxiety and a time of fears is Zygmunt Bauman in his book Liquid Fear. And I like this so much I'm going to read it at some length. So Bauman says, we're living in a sense-numbing and mind-chafing grey zone, as yet unnamed, from which ever more dense and sinister fears seep, threatening to destroy our homes, workplaces and bodies through disasters, natural but not quite, human but not completely, natural and human at the same time, though unlike either of them, the zone of which some overambitious yet hapless, accident and calamity-prone sorcerer's apprentice or a malicious genie imprudently let out of the bottle must have taken charge. Long quote, but he's only just started. He's warming to his theme. The zone where power grids go bust, petrol taps run dry, stock exchanges collapse, all-powerful companies disappear altogether with dozens of services one used to take for granted and thousands of jobs one used to believe to be rock solid, where jets crash together with their 1,001 safety gadgets and hundreds of passengers, market caprices make worthless the most precious and coveted of assets, and any other imaginable or unimaginable catastrophes brew, or perhaps are brewed, ready to overwhelm the prudent and the imprudent alike. Day in, day out, we learn that the inventory of dangers is far from complete. New dangers are discovered and announced almost daily. There is no knowing how many more of them and of what kind have managed to escape our and the experts' attention, getting ready to strike without warning. Are you quaking in your seats? It's a bleak vision, isn't it, of the contemporary period, of this notion that we're almost paralysed by anxiety. And I want to address that in relation to food. a very quick excursion into some of the philosophical writings about anxiety, and then I'll move more onto my empirical stuff. One of the reasons why anxiety is such a kind of heightened emotion is because it, according to existential philosophers like Kierkegaard and Heidegger and others, is that it threatens our lives, it threatens our mortality. So a food scare, for example, at its worst might be a matter of life and death. And it also, if it doesn't threaten our lives, it threatens our established systems of meaning, our ways of making sense of the world. So something which you took for granted, you fed your family yesterday, was a source of great pleasure, tomorrow might become suddenly something which people are telling you is dangerous to eat, might damage your health or those of your family and children. So that's important to hang on to, that anxiety might be life-threatening. It might also be a way in which our meanings become destabilised. Kierkegaard's work is really interesting because he makes the, I think, really important point that anxiety is not just a source of paralysis, a la Bauman. It could also be creative. You know, a life lived without any anxiety might be rather dull, might be rather mundane. You know, the right modulation of anxiety to the right level might be just what we want. It gives a sense of being alive, being on the edge. So we're not trying necessarily to rid the world of anxiety, but we're trying to stop it being a disabling condition. And Kierkegaard talked about being educated by anxiety. You know, if you've got rid of, from his point of view, untenable religious beliefs, came to terms with the existential condition, you will be educated, you'll be able to move forward. My third point here is that anxiety is both a pervasive condition or force within modern societies. It spreads, it's like this, but it also has this kind of amplitude, is that the word? It goes up and down. So we might think about anxiety as something which is a condition of modern life, but we also can think about the way in which it's intensified by specific events. So a food scare comes along and our level of anxiety might go up. As it's then, it disappears or it's contained or a new way of making sense is put in place, it subsides, doesn't go away altogether. So there's a sort of underlying level, and then there's this notion of it being intensified by specific events. And the other thing that's important about thinking of anxiety as a social thing is that we can be drawn into a state or condition of anxiety even if we're ourselves not anxious. So when Tesco removes your favourite value burgers from the shelves, you're drawn into a social condition about anxiety, about food safety or food quality or whatever, whether or not you care. If you still wanted to eat beef on the bone during BSE, if you were not scared of it, if you were not fearful, there's still a social condition there telling us as part of the discourse that this is something to worry about. Okay, I tried to formalise some of that discussion in a paper I wrote with my colleague Jonathan Everts in Environment and Planning A few years ago now. Seems like only yesterday, but I'm alarmed to see it was 2010, where we argued, as I think I've just done, but I'll set it out here, and I'll come back to this at the end in terms of how the horsemeat issue might be thought about in these terms. Anxiety events like food scares are powerful because of the way they rupture our everyday lives. They disrupt our normal sense that food is pleasurable, that we eat food every day, so on. So it disrupts established routines, and it persists until something tells us life can go on. Anxieties are framed by a whole different series of communities of practice, as they might be called, so by the media, by government agencies, by commercial retailers and so on. Food-related anxieties often move between social fields, so something which starts out as a question about public health might then move into a question of environmental sustainability or animal welfare or so on. They vary across time and space, they spread or they're contained. As I've already mentioned, that often one of the conditions of anxiety is an uncertainty or a gap in knowledge and understanding. And the example I gave before about whether or not to wash your chicken is a really good one. I think where expert advice might say one thing, lay understandings and common sense and finding out about food from your mother or from magazines or whatever says something different. That is a very ripe, fertile field. And then lastly, and very importantly I think, particularly food-related anxieties, get to be moralised to varying degrees. And I've just got one example here, I could have hundreds. But do you remember back in 2006 in Rawmarsh, just up the road from where I live in Yorkshire, the so-called sinner ladies, terrible pun on dinner ladies, were serving children hamburgers and chips and kebabs through the railings of the school, and Jamie Oliver got hold of it and the Ministry of Food was born, and so on. And it went from the Sun to the New York Times within a week. It persisted for months, and through Jamie Oliver and government issues around school meals, it became a highly politicised and I'd argue moralised issue. So, you know, sinners and junk food are not innocent terms, I don't think. You could think about the alleged decline of the Sunday lunch as well as an almost religious institution in Britain. So food anxieties are frequently moralised and sometimes to a very high degree. Okay. What I want to do in hopefully a slightly shorter second half of the talk is to think about the recent horsemeat incident and whether we can approach that as a food-related anxiety and whether we can start to understand it in terms of some of the ideas and definitions and frameworks that I've been talking about so far. And hopefully this is sufficiently recent that most of you have a recollection of this, and most of you will know whether you were anxious or not in a personal, individual sense. Government was anxious about it. Tesco's in particular, but also food retailers were very, very anxious about it and lost a lot of money and trust as a result of it. But one simple thing to think about is, Kevin in the introduction talked about incident, and he also used the word scandal about food. And just that, just thinking about how you would describe this event or series of events, what language you would use, itself starts to give you a kind of window on how to address food anxieties. So in this case, the Food Standards Agency talked about an incident, or occasionally an issue. That's interesting. Incident's fairly sort of self-contained, isn't it? It's a blip. It's been an incident, but we'll be all right. So incident was one word. Tesco's described it as a problem. It was a hugely significant commercial problem for them, more than the other supermarkets, but also for retailers in general. The Irish Department of Agriculture talked about a saga. The Minister of Agriculture in Ireland talked about a controversy, and I think that was partly because his family was involved as well. He was Minister of Agriculture. I think his brother was a meat producer, processor. And the newspapers tended to think in terms of scandal, because scandals sell newspapers and scandals have a sort of sexual connotation and all the rest of it. So just starting with that, what was the horsemeat issue, controversy, incident is an interesting place to start, I think. Again, an important thing to do is not to think of it as just one thing that happened at one point, but to think about it as in a more historical context. So Britain in particular, but other places have been interested in food scares for generations at least, and certainly public concerns about the adulteration of beer and bread and so on in the 1870s were the very things that gave rise to our first national food safety legislation. I was going to make a point here about Professor Terry Marsden's work, because in one of his books about consuming interests, he talks about the way in which government mishandling or perceived mishandling of the BSE crisis led to the establishment of the Food Standards Agency in 2000, kind of more arm's length from agricultural producer interests. And then people like the Curry Commission in the year 2002, in the aftermath of the food and mouth, most recent food and mouth outbreak, talked about how the UK's agri-food system was dysfunctional. Farming had become detached from the rest of the economy and environment. The kind of argument, the central argument of the Curry Commission was about reconnecting producers and consumers, farming to environment, and so on. So there's a historical context to horsemeat that we shouldn't lose sight of. And then I'll just do this quite quickly, but the chronology of this incident, event, whatever we want to call it, is significant in terms of what I've been saying about consumer anxiety, because it wasn't a single event. It was a series of things that happened over a period of literally months. And just as the kind of one issue was tailing away, another one will come along and stoke the fire again. So it started in, well, that's interesting as well. It started, as far as the UK is concerned, in mid-February this year, when the FSA announced that the Irish Food Authority, the FSAI, had found horse and pig DNA in a range of beef products on sale in UK supermarkets, Tesco's, Aldi, Lidl and Iceland. 10 million burgers and other food products were removed from public sale. So for a relatively small set of, what were found to be a small set of adulterated food products, massive disruption to the retailers and arguably to people's everyday lives. The FSAI, the Irish inquiry, involved what they called a targeted survey of beef products purchased from Irish retailers in November 2012. So the first thing is this goes back to 2012, to November, suggests a slightly more longer running issue. But it also suggests that they were very efficient in targeting a small number of products and finding of the 27 products they surveyed, 10 tested positive for horse DNA and more for undeclared pig DNA. And this led people to think this wasn't just a sort of casual survey of a few retailers. They were responding to information, sometimes called a tip-off, prior intelligence, whatever you want to call it. So it wasn't just a sort of run-of-the-mill set of surveys of food establishments. It was a targeted survey because there was reason to believe something was amiss. Most of the products that were tested showed a low level of, or none, or a low level of contamination or adulteration. But of course, the one we all remember is the Tesco Everyday Value burgers, where horse meat accounted for 29% of the total meat content of that product. This is the last of this chronological thing, but as I say, just as that incident was fading away, the 1st of February 2013, beef products that had been certified as halal that were supplied to prisons in England and Wales were reported to contain pork DNA. On the 4th of February, a large quantity of equine DNA was found in frozen raw ingredients at a processing plant in County Monaghan. A few days later, Findus lasagna was found to contain more than 60% horse meat. Aldi lasagna and spaghetti bolognese were tested positive, more than 30% horse meat. And this was significant because it suggested it was not just one supply chain to one retailer, Tesco, that was the problem. Completely separate supply chains to different firms had discernible levels of horse meat in them. And this led then to wider testing, both by local authorities, but also by the food industry itself. A day later, the police were called in because the evidence of what they call gross negligence or deliberate contamination suggested that this was not just contamination by accident, but adulteration that was quite deliberate. A slaughterhouse in Todmorden was raided a few days later, and 3 arrests followed. And the day after that, the European Council of Agriculture and Fisheries met, which suggested that this was now not a UK or Irish issue. It was something affecting European food systems more generally. So incident, I think, is an odd way to refer to a set of events that went on in this, well, already now for more than a month, but as you'll see, for longer than that. The test results are interesting, I think, because they revealed or confirmed that the vast majority of samples of food on sale in the UK through retailers had no discernible horse DNA in them. But the discernible stuff was interesting. The FSA set almost overnight what it called a pragmatic threshold, or 1% threshold. And they did that because it wasn't the lowest level at which we could discern horse DNA in a beef product. It was a level that was set to determine what might happen by accident, by not effective cleaning between a piece of machinery that produces beef and then goes on to process a pork sample. That might produce a small level, a trace level, or a larger level, but 1% was considered a cutoff that would distinguish between gross contamination and trace level DNA that could just happen kind of adventitiously. So majority of samples had less than this 1% pragmatic threshold, but 29 samples from 7 products eventually were shown to have more than 1% undeclared horse meat. And later on, a further 6 positives, and then a third set in June 2013 had 3 more positives. So this became then an issue of the content of products that we thought were one thing that turned out to be something different. And it also showed shed a lot of light on questions of traceability and supply chains and their management and transparency. So EFRA, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, argued that in simple terms, the supply chain for a beef burger should just be farmer, abattoir, processor and retailer. A simple, short, transparent chain, but in practice, it said, supply chains are much more complex with not just multiple suppliers, but also multiple ingredients. And the chain, as I'll see in a slide in a moment, involves a whole series of subcontractors, brokers, traders, and agents. So the point about content is that your economy burger from Tesco could have as little as 50% beef in it, the rest being water, added protein, or sometimes called filler, starch and other ingredients. So journalists like Felicity Lawrence revealed these kind of issues. The Irish authorities later confirmed that filler product from Poland was the most likely source of horsemeat contamination in their burgers. And the Silvercrest factory in County Monaghan, the one that supplied Tesco with the burgers with 29% horsemeat, was shown to use multiple ingredients from as many as 40 suppliers. And in an actual run of producing burgers, they could shift from one supplier to another in as short a period as 30 minutes. So these are big industrial processes with a large number of ingredients coming from a lot of different places. Lots of different, you remember I talked about different communities of practice helping to frame a food anxiety. Well, it's interesting to think about who were some of the communities of practice and how they interpreted or framed the argument from their point of view, if you like, representing their interests. So the NFU said that UK farmers and other members of the food supply chain are under increasing amounts of pressure from large companies, in particular retailers, to produce food ever cheaper. It's vital this drive towards more for less does not compromise consumer health, the need for transparency, and ultimately consumer confidence. And Tesco's, in some quite amazing full-page advertisements that most of you will have seen, I think, admitted, if you like, acknowledged that their supply chain had become too complicated. We're reviewing our approach to our supply chain, building a thorough traceability system that includes DNA testing, which will help set new standards for the industry. And there were a series of these you'll have seen in lots of the broadsheet newspapers. We apologise, things will be different now, and a lot of emphasis on provenance and Britishness to shorten supply chains and to use nationality, Britishness, as a sort of quasi-guarantee of quality. And this was, if you read the Guardian newspaper, you'll have seen this map or a version of this map. This is a fantastic kind of revelation of the complexity of food supply chains within Europe. It shows two cases here, but the one I'm focusing on is the red one. A food presser called Comigel in northeast France had a subsidiary called Tavola, who made beef, lasagna and other products for Findus. Tavola contacted the French meat processor Spanghero, who liaised with their subcontractors in Cyprus, who supplied the meat via a Dutch trader who ordered the meat from a Romanian abattoir. This is a complex food supply chain with lots of middlemen, if I can use that phrase, with lots of agents and merchants involved. So while Tesco might think it's getting food from a particular or any supermarket, in many cases the supply chain is much more complex than that. And if you go back, this is now on if you go on Google Images, you can get this map and click on it, and it's a very nice animation of the complexity of contemporary supply chains. I'll be about five or 10 more minutes. One question about this food anxiety then is, what kind of anxiety was it? It's not a conventional food scare, in that at no point did anyone say eating horse meat was likely to damage your health. There was a small issue around the equine drug phenylbutazone, or bute, which if consumed by humans in very large quantities could pose a threat. But the Department of Health was quick to say that wasn't the issue. So in other words, it's a different kind of issue about the transparency of food chains, about regulation and so on. The Chartered Institute of Environmental Health put it nicely: an inability to properly account for the ingredients of any foodstuff might reasonably suggestive of other shortcomings, any of which might endanger health. So perhaps it was a health scare, only in the sense that if they're doing this within the process, can we have confidence they're not doing something else that might be a direct health issue? And the EFRA committee I've already quoted says it seems improbable that individuals prepared to pass horsemeat off as beef illegally are applying the high hygiene standards rightly required in the food production industry. So again, different communities of practice framing issues in slightly different ways. So not a food scare in the conventional this will damage your health kind of way, but a different kind of anxiety in my terms. I think these were really interesting frames as well. Felicity Lawrence, the journalist I've already mentioned, who writes in The Guardian, started to say, well, shouldn't we have seen this coming? Isn't this something we could have anticipated? Horse meat is much cheaper than beef, the cost of beef. Couldn't we have thought about the possibility of fraud, the opportunity for people to exploit this? It was very clear, she says, why some people might want to substitute cheaper ingredients somewhere in the supply chain. The cost of a quarter pounder using lean beef is about 43 pence, she estimated. Frozen economy burgers, 25 pence. And Paul Wilgos, who's the head of food technology at Marks and Spencer's, it's a question of being vigilant about where the incentives for fraud might be. And the Troop report, which was the independent report commissioned by the Food Standards Agency into the horsemeat incident, talked about deficiencies in the horse passport system that allows you to track where horses are moving and what kind of medical or other conditions they might have. And it suggested the FSA, the Food Standards Agency, needed to improve its intelligent monitoring systems. Paul Wiles, a criminologist, social scientist involved in as a member of the FSA board, said simply, think crime. So the Food Standards Agency does horizon scanning, it does foresight things, it does a whole series of other things, but it had never really done anything that focused on fraud and crime. It did food safety. It had a quite narrowly defined framing of this potential issue. I think almost lastly, before my summary slides, the issue of horsemeat in 2013 raises some really interesting questions about governance and regulation. So when the incident happened, the Food Standards Agency was asked by the Cabinet Office to take the lead role in managing the incident. The FSA is responsible for food safety incidents, including misleading labelling and food fraud, with possible food safety implications. So the remit of the FSA had been changed so that some issues that it used to deal with went to DEFRA. Other issues it used to deal with went to Department of Health. And yet when the incident came up, Cabinet Office's first move was to ask the FSA to champion or lead the investigation of the issue. The Troop report says that initial hesitancy about whose job it was to manage this incident delayed action being taken. And you can see the FSA might not want to do this because it's likely to damage its reputation. It gets drawn into an anxiety about horsemeat that's nothing to do with its food safety remit. So there's a paper I'm writing about this. There's a long discussion about this whole question about if food authenticity and labelling are to do DEFRA's issue, why did the FSA end up leading this investigation? Okay, that's enough of that. Okay, very quickly then to draw these thoughts together. What I want to do is pull these two different bits of the presentation together. So the first part was about a kind of approach to anxiety as a social condition. And these bits in yellow are my summaries of the previous slides when I was trying to set out how we might approach food anxieties. And the bits in white underneath are thinking about how this might then be relevant to the horsemeat question. So I said initially, if you remember, that anxiety events like food scares rupture the fabric of everyday life, they disrupt established routines and rhythms, and they persist until a new consensus is firmly in place. And what I said as we went through was this isn't a single incident, a particular event. It's a protracted set of events that took place over a period of 6 months and indeed are still going on. So just a couple of weeks ago now, news reports like horse DNA detected in canned beef from Romania came on the FSA's news pages. Didn't get lots of media attention because, you know, our attention span had been exhausted, kind of thing. But I would argue that this succession of events and even the way in which the test results were kind of drip fed to us in 2 or 3 different stages might have prolonged public anxiety. I've talked about the way anxieties are framed by different communities of practice. So we start with the Food Standards Agency Ireland. We then see it as an incident that's framed by the FSA UK, Department of Health's involved, the police are involved, European authorities are involved, newspapers, retailers, and on and on. I started with the question of terminology, I won't go back to that. It's framed by different communities of practice in terms of their own interests. So the NFU, as an example, talked about the impact of foreign competition and retailers screwing down prices on British farmers. I haven't had time to talk about this, but the role of science in emergencies is really interesting. There weren't many labs that could do the tracing of food products to the level required, and had the incident gone on for much longer or become a bigger issue, that would be an issue. The question of is 1% the right level at which to define the difference between accidental contamination and deliberate adulteration is a key question. So the FSA did a very quick kind of consumer panel that said 1%, you okay with that? You know, that's the difference between something that's just an accident and something that's gross. And most people said that's fine, but of course not faith communities, Muslim or Jewish communities, who might worry a lot about pork contamination of beef products, for example. And it also, again in Terry's absence, I'll talk about the kind of work he did about, one argument about retail food governance in the UK is it's retailer-led. The supermarkets have so much to lose if things go wrong. They say, trust us, we'll take this on. We don't need lots of expenditure of government money to do lots of checking and so on. Trust, and I think there's a strong argument now that says that that level of trust has been undermined. Anxieties move between social fields, I suggested. This was principally a question of what the FSA will call authenticity. You know, is it beef or is it pork? And the level of food fraud or criminality rather than public health. But it also starts to raise questions about the integrity of food supply chains, the sustainability of current modes of production, the ability or otherwise of the food industry to police itself. The crisis clearly began in Ireland and then spreads rapidly to the UK and the rest of Europe. Initially confined to cheaper frozen products, but later spread to other products and suppliers when even Waitrose had to withdraw burgers from sale as a precautionary measure. They proliferate in conditions of ambivalence and uncertainty. So I mentioned very quickly the uncertainty over whose job it was to manage this crisis. Was it the FSA? Should it have been DEFRA or Department of Health or someone else? I mentioned the complexity of the regulatory system. I haven't really, but the regulatory system in this case involves a whole series of different authorities and jurisdictions. You know, food scares, food chains are no respecters of national and international boundaries. There are lots of different government departments involved. There are lots of different jurisdictions and territorial authorities. And it's also significant that the adulteration of beef with horse meat is a source of anxiety because you can't see it. You don't. So someone like Ulrich Beck, writing about Risk Society, said that food risks spread as the stowaways of normal consumption. They travel on the wind and in the air, passing through all the otherwise strictly controlled protective areas of modernity. So there's something about the visibility or otherwise that's relevant. And the last of these slides then is that anxieties are moralised to varying degrees. In this case, I think, it wasn't a widespread panic about the safety of beef products in the UK. It wasn't a wholesale kind of moral panic, although it did lead to a very significant decline of trust in retailers, particularly Tesco, and to a dip in the confidence we have in the Food Standards Agency to regulate. The Irish report, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and the Marine, spoke about real concern, inexcusable failure, improper practices and irregularities. So it's moving towards a kind of moralised language, but not at all to the same degree as debates about free school meals and Jamie Oliver and all the rest. And Tesco's public apology, one of which I showed you, talks about the need to be open about what we do, how everyone deserves to eat well, no matter what you spend. So issues of transparency and trust. Okay, I promised I'd talk for no more than 50 minutes and people were going to start hurling things at me. I was coughing loudly. You've been very, very polite and patient. And we probably started a few minutes late. The last slide then, I just want to conclude what I've tried to say this evening. I began, you remember, with some statistics about levels of anxiety, consumer anxiety about food across Europe from a big European-wide survey. I presented, I call it a theory of anxiety, that's rather grand, perhaps a framework for how we might think about anxiety as a social condition that fluctuates across time and space, not simply something about individual pathology. I talked about food-related anxieties as a sort of current that then gets intensified by particular events. And then I tried to use the recent Horsemeat incident as a case study of how this approach to social anxiety might be applied in practice. And I want to end up with that little caution I made near the beginning, I think, that by focusing on food anxiety, you can get yourself quickly into a sort of Zygmunt Bauman frame of mind where the game is up kind of thing. And I don't think that's the case. I think what these kind of issues and thinking about food more generally leads us towards is thinking of food as part of a dialectical process where we're both fearful and fascinated by novel foods, for example, where we both desire particular kinds of foods, but we might also dread others. Some of us were talking about that at the start. So I think part of the power of food to disrupt and make us anxious comes from that sense that it is both a source of enormous pleasure, everyday lives, family lives, something ingested physically, bodily, and so on. And it's that partly which also gives rise to food as a source of widespread anxiety. Thank you very much.
I hope you'll all agree that we've been treated to an excellent presentation this evening. And while you're all thinking about some smart questions to put Peter, because I did promise him a lively and challenging Q&A session, so I hope the audience isn't going to let me down. But while you're thinking of those questions, I can't resist just being reminded of one incident. In March, during the height of this Horsemeat scandal, we were at a conference, a food conference in Philadelphia, where I literally, honestly, speculated about something, a dimension of it, and the audience roared with laughter, thinking I'd made a joke. Well, all I'd said was that I thought maybe this was a unique moment in the history of food adulteration, where the adulteration, alleged, had actually improved the nutritional quality of the burgers. And I was being genuinely, because I do actually believe that may have been true. And yet the audience, largely American, but not entirely, thought that this was a real hoot. And they all burst out laughing and left me discombobulated. On that, so the Horsemeat story reminded me of that bizarre moment in Philadelphia.